When I arrived in Kalamazoo, it was October and the war was still on. Gold and silver stars hung on pennants in the silent windows of white and brick red cottages. In one backyard, an old man was burning leaves and twigs while a gray-haired woman was sitting on the porch, her red hands quiet on her lap, watching the smoke rising above the elms, both of them thinking the same thought, perhaps about the tall, grinning boy with blue eyes and flying hair, who had gone out to war. Where could he be now this month when leaves were turning into gold, and the fragrance of gathered apples was in the wind? It was a cold night when I left my room at the hotel for another speaking engagement. I walked but a little way. A heavy wind coming up from Lake Michigan was icy on the face. It felt like winter straying early from the northern woodlands. Under the lamppost, the leaves shone like bronze, and they fluttered on the pavements like the ghost feet of a thousand autumns long dead. Long before the boys left for faraway lands without great icy winds and promise of winter early in the year, lands without apple trees, the singing, and the gold. It was the same night that I had met Celestino Fabia, just a Filipino farmer, as he called himself. He has a farm about 30 miles east from Kalamazoo. You came all the way on a night just to hear me talk? I asked. I've seen no Filipinos for many years now, he answered quickly. So when I saw your name on the papers where it says you come from the islands and you are going to talk, I come right away. Earlier that night, I had addressed a college crowd, mostly women. It appeared that they had wanted me to talk about my country. They wanted me to tell them things about it because my country had become a lost country. Everywhere in the land the enemy stalked. Over it a great silence hung and the boys were there, unheard from. Or they were on their way there, at some little known island in the Pacific. Young boys, all, hardly men, thinking of the harvest moons and the smell of forest fire. It was not hard talking about our own people. They seemed so far away during those terrible years that I must have spoken of them with nostalgia and fervor. In the open forum that followed, the audience wanted to know whether there was much difference between our women and the American women. I tried to answer the questions as best as I could, saying among other things I did not know much about American women, except that they looked friendly, but differences or similarities in inner qualities, such as naturally belong to the heart or to the mind, I could only speak about with big vagueness. While I was trying to explain the fact that it was not easy to make comparison, a man rose in the rear of the hall wanting to say something. In the distance, he looked slight and old and very brown. Even before he spoke, I knew that he was, like me, a Filipino. I am a Filipino, he began loud and clear, in a voice that seemed used to wide open spaces. I'm just a Filipino farmer out in the country. He waved his hand toward the door. I left the Philippines more than 20 years ago and have never been back. Never will, perhaps. I want to find out, sir, are our Filipino women the same like they were 20 years ago? As he sat down, the hall filled with voices, hushed and intrigued. I weighed my answer carefully. It seemed to me, as I looked toward my countryman, that I must give him an answer he would understand, and that would not shatter some of the illusions he probably held. First, I said, as the voices gradually died down and every eye seemed upon me. First, tell me what our women were like 20 years ago. The man stood up to answer. Yes, he said. You're too young. 20 years ago, our women were nice. They were modest, they wore their hair long, they dressed proper, and went for no monkey business. They were natural. They went to church regularly, and they were faithful. He had spoken slowly, and now, in what seemed like an afterthought, he added, "It's the men who ain't." Now I knew what I was going to say. Well, I began. It will interest you to know that all women have changed. The change, however, has been on the outside only. Inside here, pointing to the heart. They are the same as they were 20 years ago. The man was visibly moved. "I'm very happy, sir," he said. Later, as he and I met outside, he gave me his name and told me of his farm 30 miles east of the city. We had stopped at the main entrance to the hotel lobby. We had not talked very much on the way. As a matter of fact, we were never alone. Kind American friends came along with us, asked us questions, and said good night. So now I asked him whether he cared to step into the lobby with me and talk. "No, thank you," he said. "You are tired, and I don't want to stay out too late." "Yes, you live very far. I got a car," he said. "Besides." Now he smiled. I had been watching his face, and I wondered whether he could smile. He had been so tense. "Will you do me a favor, please?" he asked. "I want you to have dinner with my family out in the country. I'd call for you tomorrow afternoon. Then I'll drive you back. Would you?" "Of course," I said. "I'd love to meet your family. I was leaving Kalamazoo for Muncie, Indiana, in 2 days. There was plenty of time." "You will make my wife very happy," he said. "You flatter me." "Honest, she'll be very happy. Ruth is a country girl and hasn't met any Filipino younger than I. We're just poor farmer folks, you know, and we don't get to town very often. Roger, that's my boy. He goes to school in town. A bus takes him early in the morning and he's back in the afternoon. He's a nice boy." "I bet he is," I agree. "I've seen the children of some Filipinos by their American wives, and the boys are generally taller than their fathers, and very good looking." "Roger, he'll be tall. You'll like him." Then he said goodbye. The next day he came, at about 3 in the afternoon. There was a mild, ineffectual sun shining, but it was not too cold. He was wearing an old brown tweed jacket and worsted trousers to match. His shoes were polished, and although the green of his tie was faded, a colored shirt accentuated it. He looked younger than he had the night before. Now that he was clean-shaven, as if ready to go to a party, he was grinning. "Oh, Ruth can't believe it. She can't believe it," he kept repeating as he led me to his car, a nondescript thing in chip black that had known better days and many hands. I say to her, "I'm bringing you a first-class Filipino," and she says, "Aw, go away, quit kidding. There's no such thing as a first-class Filipino." "But Roger, that's my boy." He believed me immediately. "What's he like, Daddy?" he asks. "Oh, you will see." I say, "He's first class." "Like you, Daddy?" "No, no," I laugh at him. "Your daddy ain't first class." "Oh, but you are," he says. So you can see what a nice boy he is. So innocent. Then Ruth starts griping about the house. "But the house is a mess," she says. "True, it's a mess. It's always a mess. But don't mind that. We're poor folks, you know." The trip seemed interminable. We passed through narrow lanes and plunged into thickets. Came out on barren land overgrown with weeds. All around were dead leaves. In the distance were groves of apple trees. "Aren't those apple trees?" I asked, wanting to be sure. "Yes, those are apple trees," he replied. "Do you like apples? I got lots of them. I got an apple orchard. I'll show you." All the beauty of the afternoon seemed in the distance, on the hills, in the dull, soft sky. "Those trees are beautiful on the hills," I said. "Autumn's a lovely season. The trees are getting ready to shed their leaves, and they show their colors, proud-like." "No such things in our own country," I said. That remark seemed unkind. I realized later. It touched him off on a tangent long deserted but ever there, perhaps. How often does the lonely mind take such unpleasant detours away from the familiar winding leaves toward home for fear of this? The long-lost youth, the remembered hurt. How many times indeed, only the exile knows. It was a rugged road we were traveling, and the car made so much noise that I could not hear everything my companion said. But I understood him. He was telling his story for the first time in many years. He was remembering his own youth. He was thinking of home. Now there seemed no cause for fear, no cause for pain. That would come later. In the night, perhaps, on the lonely farm under the apple trees. In my old Visayan town, the streets are narrow and dirty and strewn with coral shell. You have not been there. You could not have missed our house. It was the biggest in town, one of the oldest. Ours was a big family. The house stood right at the side of the street. A door opened heavily on the dark hall leading to the stairs. There's the smell of the chickens roosting, the familiar sound they made. As you grope your way up, the banister smooth under the hand. Mother sits in her corner, looking very white and sick. This was all of her world, her domain. During all those years, I have not been able to recall the sound of her voice. Father was different. He moved about. He shouted, he ranted, he lived largely in the past, and talked of honor as if it were the only thing. I was born in that house. I grew up there, into a pampered brat. I was mean. One day, when I was older, I broke their hearts. I saw mother cry wordlessly as father heaped his curses upon me and drove me out of the house. The gate closing heavily after me, and my brothers and sisters took up my father's hate for me and multiplied it numberless times in their own broken hearts. I was no good. But sometimes, I miss my brothers and sisters. Mother sitting in her chair, looking like a pale ghost in the corner of the room. I remember the great live posts of the house, massive tree trunks from the forest. Leafy twigs grew on the sides and buds, pointing downward, wilted and died before they could become flowers. As they fell on the floor, father bent to throw them out into the coral streets. His hands were strong. I have kissed those hands many times, many times. Finally, we rounded a sharp curve and came upon a shanty, all but ready. It seemed to crumble in a heap, its plastered wall rotting away, the floor hardly a foot from the ground. I thought of the cottages of the poor colored folk in the south, the hovels of the poor everywhere in the land. This one stood all by itself, as though by common consent. All the folks that used to live here had decided to stay away, despising it, ashamed of it. Even this lovely autumn season could not color with beauty. A dog barked loudly as we approached. A fat blonde woman stood in the doorway and a little boy by her side. Roger seemed newly scrubbed. He hardly took his eyes off. Ruth had a clean apron around her shapeless waist. Now, as she shook my hands in sincere delight, I noticed, shamefacedly, that I should notice, how rough her hands, how coarse and red with labor, how ugly. She was no longer young, and her smile was pathetic. As we stepped inside and the door closed behind us, immediately I was aware of the familiar scent of apples. The room was bare, except for a few pieces of second-hand furniture. In the middle of the room stood the stove to keep the family warm in winter. The walls here were bare. Over the dining table hung a lamp, yet unlighted. Ruth got busy with the drinks. She kept coming in and out a rear room that must have been the kitchen, and soon the table was heavy with food, fried chicken and rice, and green peas, corn on the cob. Even as we ate, Ruth kept getting up and going to the kitchen for more food. Roger ate like a little gentleman. "Isn't he nice looking?" his father asked. "You are a handsome boy, Roger," I said. The boy smiled at me. "You look like Daddy," he said. After I noticed an old picture leaning on the top of the dresser, and I rose to look at it. It was yellow and soiled with finger marks. The faded figure of a woman in Philippine dress could still be distinguished, although the face had become a blur. "You're," I began. "I don't know who she is," Fabia hastened to say. "I picked up that picture many years ago in a loom on LaSalle Street in Chicago. I have often wondered who she is. The face wasn't a blur in the beginning. Oh no, it was a young face, and good." Ruth came in with a plate full of apples. "Ah," I cried, picking out a ripe one. "I've been wondering where all this scent of apples came from. The room is full of it." "I'll show you," said Fabia. He showed me a back room, not very large. It was half full of apples. "Every day," he explained, "I take some of them into town to sell to the groceries. Prices have been low. I have been losing on the trips. These apples will spoil," I said. "We'll feed them to the pigs." Then he showed me around the farm. It was twilight now, and the apple tree stood bare against a glowing western sky. "An apple blossom time. It must be lovely there," I thought. But what about winter time? One day, according to Fabia, a few years before Roger was born, he had an attack on acute appendicitis. Ruth was pregnant and not too well herself. At first time, she did not know what to do. She bundled him in warm clothing and put him on a cot near the stove, where he lay while she shoveled the snow away from their front door. Then she carried and sometimes dragged the suffering man over the path toward the road, where they waited for the mail truck to pass. Meanwhile, snow piled up all over them as she kept rubbing the man's arms and leg, and she herself nearly froze to death. As she rubbed him, tears rolled down her cheeks. "I won't leave you. I won't leave you," she kept on saying. Finally, the U.S. mail truck arrived, who knew them well, helped them board the truck, and took the sick man and his wife direct to the nearest hospital. Ruth stayed in the hospital with Fabia. She slept in a corridor outside the ward, and in the daytime helped in scrubbing the floor and washing the dishes and cleaning the men's things. They didn't have enough money to pay the hospital bill, but Ruth was willing to work like a slave. "Ruth's a nice girl," said Fabia, "like our own Filipino women." Before nightfall, he was to take me back to the hotel. Ruth and Roger stood for a moment at their door, holding hands and smiling at me. Inside the room of the shanty, a low light flickered. I had the last glimpse of the apple trees in the orchard, under the darkened sky as Fabia backed up his car, and soon we were on our way back to town. His dog had started barking. We could hear it for some time, until finally we could not hear it anymore. All was darkness around us, except where the headlamps revealed the stretch of the road ahead. Fabia did not talk this time. I didn't seem to have anything to say myself. But when finally we reached the hotel and I got down, Fabia said, "Well, I guess I won't be seeing you again." It was dimly lighted in front of the hotel, and I could hardly see Fabia's face. He has not stepped out of the car, but he extended his hand, and I gripped it. "Tell Ruth and Roger," I said. "I love them." He dropped my hand quickly. "They'll be waiting for me now," he said. "Look," I said, hardly knowing why I said it. "One of these days, very soon I hope, I'll be going home. I could go to your town." "No," he said softly. "Thanks a lot, but you see me, nobody would have remembered me now." Then he started the car, and as it moved away, he waved his hand. "Goodbye," I said, waving back into the darkness. And suddenly the night was cold like winter straying early from the northern woodlands. I hurried inside. There was a train in the next morning that I left from Muncie, Indiana, at a quarter after 8. Thank you.